Hello and welcome to this week's presentation. I'm John and I'm joined with my teammate Beth, and we're here to talk to you about the role of context in our course organizational learning. And what we wanted to do with this presentation is to give you, instead of spending 15 minutes just talking at you using PowerPoint, we really wanted to just kind of have a conversation, make it more like a podcast, and give you our thoughts and overview of what we read and what we talked about as a team, and then kind of give you the best of our thoughts as we move forward. So, Beth, would you mind go ahead and pulling out those goals that we have for this presentation?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to talk about the impact of context and the impact of the environment, and then also we're going to talk a little bit about the global context and how that impacts organizational learning. So, John, do you want to talk about the basics of context?
I would love to. So, to kind of set the frame for what we're going to do here with this presentation, we wanted to really get into the very basic idea of what context is. We both agree that we really need to define it in order to really kind of throw it around all the time when we talk about context, contextual things. So, we pulled out the dictionary and found out Merriam-Webster defines context as the interrelated conditions in which something exists or occurs. And we use this all the time in our daily lives through the English language. We use words like bat, where you need to use context to decide if that's an animal or a piece of sporting equipment that you use and play sports. Um, we use it all the time, and that's really important not only in just speaking, but also in organizational learning. And we're going to discuss that today, some of those factors. The other thing about contextual factors is that more than likely they're out of your control as a leader or as an organization. You don't have control over government regulations or market forces or public opinion, those types of things. So it's really important to understand what context is and recognize it so you can assess the likelihood of your organizational learning efforts and if they're going to be successful, if they're not going to be successful because of the context that they're in, and then how to take action to increase that level of success as you move forward. I know the first topic of conversation we wanted to get straight into here is the impact of context and organizational learning. And Beth, would you mind go ahead and give us some thoughts there about old Lipschitz?
So, from the Lipschitz reading, we really have six factors, six contextual factors that influence learning. And in the reading, toward the end, the factors are divided into those that really drive organizational learning and those that can either drive or restrain learning. So, the ones that can drive learning are environmental uncertainty, task uncertainty, error criticality, and proximity to the core task of the organization. And the ones that stuck out for me were environmental uncertainty. I absolutely, for me, true to life, if I'm uncertain about something or if I experience doubt, that's when I'm motivated to learn. And then I know, John, you and I joked about in my organization, we use the term kind of, it's okay, nobody died today, as kind of a loose way of saying it's really not that critical or it's not that
Mm-hmm.
big of a deal. So for us, error criticality is a little bit looser, which may or may not drive learning. And I know for you, the experience is a little different if you
It
want to talk
is, and
about that.
I think that's funny because it is context, right? I mean, in your context, it's not that big of a deal, but in my context, it may be a big deal. We say the same thing. At least nobody died today, but we really do mean that. Whew, I'm glad nobody died in this evolution that we did launch in the small boat or search and rescue cases. So it is funny to me that we both say the same sentence, but using context, it's totally different when it comes to
Yeah.
error criticality and catastrophic life-threatening things. It depends on what the organization's about and how important that is and what you learn from that. So yeah, definitely that is a funny moment that we brought up.
Very true. Do you want to spend a few minutes talking about the factors that can either drive or restrain?
I would love to. I think, and I know we discussed this before we wanted to record. It is interesting. I think the way they broke that up here, I didn't really recognize it until I read the entire chapter twice. And at the end, I was like, oh, wow, that really makes a lot of sense. That there's four that really can drive organizational learning, and then two that really can either help or hurt or hinder it, depending on how it's configured. And I know the two that really can either drive or restrain organizational learning is task structure and organization structure. And I find it unique that they're both structure items. I know in my experience in the United States Coast Guard, organizational structure is a huge barrier to free flow of information. Imagine that in a hierarchy organization, that there's some kind of barrier to free flow of information. But the best example I can give you with this is that um, the book talks about factors such as size and geographic separation. Totally true. I know being stationed on a ship, we don't have time to interact with other ships and other crews of other ships. We have different goals and different understandings than other ships. And then we obviously have a huge, intense loyalty to the way we do business, the way we conduct search and rescue missions, the way we conduct law enforcement missions. And in order to increase learning, that is definitely a barrier because we don't really do share those types of things in the way that the organization is structured. So very interesting contextual factor that I found very informative the way I know how we do business and how we can probably develop some of those OLMs they talked about, having centralized OLMs and maybe a thick network. Those are definitely, there's some elements that we do. We can definitely work on that as an organization. And then task structure. I know you and I talked about this as well. I said, oh, wow, this makes sense. I know in my organization we have phases for everything, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, or whatever it may be. And we use that, what the book calls natural units, to take a point to think about what we did and what the next phase is and how do we do things better. So I know you mentioned in your organization, Beth, that that's definitely not the case.
Yeah, we tend to take a committee approach to many things, and it tends to be less process oriented and much more kind of brainstorming and free flowing thought.
Mm-hmm.
And so it made me stop and wonder about kind of the lack of structure and how that impacts organizational learning, and really thinking about kind of at the end, like if we're just tired of talking about it and we don't want to talk about it again, and if we were to put more structure into it, if maybe we might get more at the end if we would want to talk about it and break it down and do that kind of group processing in that way.
Definitely. So I know the next topic we wanted to touch on, which was the impact of the environment and organizational learning, and that was an article that we had by Ganali and Stewart, 2003, on the contingency model. And this article suggested that the perception of the environment influences the use of learning processes. And it was a very detailed article, and I had to read it several times to kind of get an idea, but a good idea of what it was discussing. I think the thing that I thought off the bat for me, which was um, kind of Lipshitz's description of the contextual factor of environmental uncertainty. And I feel like this contingency model is kind of a model of that. The perception of the environment really drives doubt and drives organizational learning.
Then part of that article that I found really interesting was the chart on page 73.
Hmm.
So it's looking at the different levels of kind of information mode or interactive mode. Information being the structural processes and the interactive being the social processes around learning, and then depending upon the level or kind of the involvement there of either of those modes, you get different types of learning. So reinventive, where you're seeing fundamental changes to existing knowledge; formative, where it's creation of new knowledge structures; adjustive, where it's really just incremental changes; and then operative, where it's validating the existing learning. And for me, right now in my organization, actually seeing kind of reinventive learning, which I think is a neat thing to see in an organization. So we're very much embracing diversity and inclusion, and we have a top-down effort as well as grassroots efforts, and then we have multiple groups across campus. I work at a university. We have multiple groups across campus, kind of working on different initiatives. So there's high uncertainty in that not everyone's sure kind of what everyone else is doing or kind of what is the right way to do it, if there is a right way to do diversity and inclusion, and high equivocality, just because there are different changes going on at different times. And not every, the communication isn't always great across groups because there are a lot of people working on this. But the change that's happening across campus and the conversations that are coming out of it are really great, and I think people are really starting to embrace it, and I think we are starting to see changes across campus. So it's been neat to see.
That's awesome. Yeah, as I read this article, I agree with you. I had to look at the graph and kind of like think about it and go back and look at the graph again, but I did find it very helpful. And I know we discussed this earlier, but that's awesome to hear a positive example of reinventive learning. I know for my organization, it doesn't seem like we do have any fundamental changes and really seek to change the way we look at high uncertainty, high equivocality. Reinventive learning just doesn't seem to be in the nature of the military. what I would say, I would think probably adjustive learning, maybe what we do a lot of, because we do have, we want to keep the existing things that we have, and we do have high uncertainty, and we really want to engage in that, but we really don't want to create new new schemas to figure this out. So it's interesting to me for me to hear your example and how that's different than my example, but yet it still uses the same terms, which is this contingency model that we're influenced by the environment around us to make changes. So that definitely is really interesting to me as we talk about this article. Um, yeah,
Great.
the next thing we wanted to talk about, I think, is
Yeah. So getting into kind of the global
yes.
context of learning, and from the Antal and Sovzak article, the thing that struck me there was just the differences in context in thinking about international, national, and local context, and the comparisons between like France and Brazil, and how the effort in Brazil was different simply because there was less kind of national structure, less national control over what they were trying to do. So it really created an interesting moment where the group in Brazil was able to engage two nonprofits to build an interesting program. And then also seeing the learning from the Brazil unit, but also from the nonprofit with the Brazil L'Oreal unit as an intermediary. So the two nonprofits learning from each other through their work with L'Oreal, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that not something, again, I don't use L'Oreal products, cosmetics, so it was all new to me. Brazil, France, all that stuff. So it was an interesting article for me to understand as I read it. And I know that kind of fed into the article that we found that I know we both want to share, which is the article from Kubarera and Takashi, the Organizational Learning Practices of Diversity and Ceremonialism, a study proposal in the multinationalist context. And what I know we wanted to share with the group here that's listening, as we make them listen to us talk about it, it's kind of related to the one we had before, the Global Context and Learning article with Brazil. Again, it's another Brazilian example about people with disabilities and inclusion and diversity. However, it's an example of what happens when an organization, a multinational organization, doesn't really follow through with organizational learning, and instead creating the processes and the schema to really change the way they do business. Instead, there's this idea or this practice of ceremonialism, where basically an organization doesn't go all the way with its understanding of what it needs to do to make a change, to really increase the knowledge and the learning of the organization. And instead, they adapt these ceremonial practices that can prevent the renewal of organizational knowledge and prevent organizational learning. Instead, it just meets the requirements that this international context requires. So in this case, Brazilian law requires, people with disability to get certain accesses, and they're hired to so many people. And instead of actually really changing the way the organization learns and gaining new knowledge, this organization instead basically did the ceremonial practice of hiring a couple extra people with disabilities and meeting the intent of the law, but not really changing the knowledge and information of the organization. On one hand, L'Oreal made some positive changes because of international context and organizational learning. On the other hand, you have to be careful that you may end up with some kind of ceremonialism where it's not really a change in your organization learning. So that's the article we came up with. And I know finally, Beth, you had some kind of requirements for our listeners out there.
Yeah. So um, on the discussion board, you'll see we're posting a scenario and a few questions. So we'll give a scenario, and then we want you to look at the contextual factors and identify which ones are most important, and then describe how you anticipate those will impact over the overall learning or the organizational effort. And just to kind of wrap up, John, what of the readings and of the conversations we had over this week, what was kind of your key takeaway from this talk about context?
I think my key takeaway was the fact of the article dealing with, I can't say the word, but equality and uncertainty. Difficult for me to say, but that concept is very unique to me, and how that was associated with informational and schema, and how those two are related. And then that graph that you shared with me earlier, and we talked about. I feel like that was really, really interesting thing, because I can definitely find parallels within my organization of certain times we used that bucket of learning and why we used it. So I definitely found some value gained by reading that and understanding that. How about you, Beth? What was the one takeaway that you have?
Yeah, the contextual factors from like Lipschitz, like the idea that
Mm-hmm.
environmental uncertainty is going to motivate learning, or error criticality, and how that impacts learning and whether or not we engage in learning. So that piece was really interesting to me.
Awesome. Well, thank you
Wonderful.
everyone for listening. Thank you, Beth, for agreeing to be with me on this podcast as
Yeah,
we
thank
move
you, John.
forward in our organizational learning. So thank you for listening, and we will see you on the discussion board.